Most bugs out there, if you see a bug, there's probably 3 or 4 species that look almost exactly like it in Kentucky. So trying to identify species is really hard. Here's some tips, more tips. This is my favorite book these days for insect ID. This is the National Wildlife Federation Guide. It's by Arthur Evans. I've got it written down in that document, so you don't have to write it down if you don't want to. But this book is really great because, for one thing, it has a whole bunch of introductory entomology in the first 30 or 40 pages. But it's organized by order and family. These colors at the top, those are orders. It's sort of hard to see in here, but those are orders. And within those orders, each creature, it will have the name of the creature, but more importantly for my purposes is it has the name of the family. And the reason why that's so important, I'll try to give you another example here. Like, here we go. Red-lined burying beetle. If I was a lot of times the kids that I work with, they'll find we have a beetle that looks a lot like this in Kentucky. They'll open the book and they'll see this, that's the red-lined burying beetle, and they write it down. But they don't happen to read here that it's Pacific Northwest, United States, west of Rockies. So there's very similar looking species all over the place. And this might not be the exact same species, but it tells me the family name. It's the carrion beetle family. So now I can be more confident. I might be wrong, but family ID is a lot more manageable than species ID. So that's just one of many examples in here of why it's sometimes good to try. And you can't fit all the species in here. There's too many, but you can fit examples of the kinds that you see over and over again. So that's why we like a book like this. There's also Bug Guide. Has anyone used Bug Guide in here before? Bugguide.net is a website that people submit photos digitally, and then experts identify them. It's a huge database. I don't know how many, I guess millions of pictures there are in there by now.
Spiders.
What now? What now?
I've used one for spiders.
Oh, was it Bug Guide? If it was Bug Guide, it was probably the same one. They have all arthropods on there. Yes, so it's got the bugs and the other arthropods too. But it's really good because it has almost any insect that you could possibly find in Kentucky is going to be on there. The problem is that there are so many pictures. They are organized by order and family, and then even genus and species, but there's just so many pictures it can sometimes take a while, but eventually you can usually find just about anything on there. And then this is one that we have at UK. This is sort of for 4-Hers and kids, and it's organized more by family, so you can find the kinds of creatures as opposed to the exact species. Identification help. If you guys email me a bug picture that you take, I can a lot of times identify that. If I see it and I'm sitting down, I'll usually identify it right then. And if it's something I don't know, it might take me 24 hours. So send me pictures of bugs. And then another thing I always try to tell people is admit to people when you don't know what it is. There's a lot of things I see that I don't know what they are. No entomologist knows all the bugs. So if you're not sure what it is, ask us for help and just say, I don't know what this is. Let's try to work together and figure out what it is. Also, Kentucky Bugs is a Facebook page run by Dr. Townsend in Entomology. He a lot of times will answer ID requests sent through Facebook. So you can send a picture through Facebook. Cool. So those are some things you can get help with identification. Here's a little bit about body parts. The reason I show you this, so now we're focusing in on insects. We're down on insects. The other arthropods will have their own body segmentation and stuff that's worthwhile to learn. But since there's so many species of insects, we're going to focus on them. What I'm trying to show here is that even though you have two kinds of insects that really aren't very closely related, you've got a grasshopper down here, which is considered kind of a primitive insect, been around for a long time. Wasp up there, which is considered a more highly evolved creature. We'll hopefully explain why that is a little bit later. But they do have the basic same body layout. All insects have basically the same body layout. So looking at that, and then looking down here, what is this? Head. What is this? What is this? Obviously here are the 6 legs. Here's the antenna, here's the eyes, here's the mouth. So they have the same kinds of parts. You'll notice that both of them have 4 wings. At least I think you can see that they both have 4 wings. But grasshoppers and wasps both have a front pair of wings and a hind pair of wings. So they do share a lot of the same parts. So even if this was a beetle, if it was a mantis, walking stick, butterfly, they have the same basic parts layout, even though they might look radically different sometimes. And by the way, we can also see some order characteristics here. So this represents the grasshopper order. Does anybody know what characteristic you have to be a grasshopper? Or a cricket or a katydid? The big, huge turkey leg, hind leg. And that's it. That's the characteristic for Orthoptera. Now you know Orthoptera, grasshoppers. Actually, the characteristics for wasps, bees, and ants. Wasps, bees, and ants go together in a group. They're in order. Hopefully you can sort of see why that is when you think about them. A lot of them have stingers. A lot of them have a very sort of round head, round thorax, round abdomen. They don't have any one characteristic that identifies them, but they do tend to have very clear wings and forewings. So that's some of the things that characterize them. What else do we have here? Mouth parts are super important for insect identification. Does anybody know what creature this is?
Butterfly.
That's a butterfly. At least I'm pretty sure it's a butterfly, because it could also be a moth. It's a butterfly, but moths have the same mouth parts. A coiled tube. That's a unique characteristic that just butterflies and moths have. So that helps to identify that order. They use that just for sucking nectar, and they can't use it for really anything else other than maybe sucking some water or occasionally blood for some moths.
Well, some moths don't have.
A few moths, yeah. A lot of these rules that I'll tell you are lies. I say all butterflies and moths have a coiled mouth part. It's not always true. Luna moth, for instance, has no mouth. No mouth at all. How's that possible?
Eat all their food when they're a caterpillar.
They get all their nourishment when they're a caterpillar. When they turn into a moth, they don't bother to make mouths in their cocoon, and they just use whatever nourishment they had to get through a couple of weeks to mate and then lay eggs, and then they fall over dead. So that's why they don't. That's why some insects don't have mouths. Mayflies don't have functional mouths. And then that creature over there happens to be a beetle larva, but that shows you mandibles. Most insects have mandibles. So caterpillars have mandibles. All beetles have mandibles. Grasshoppers too. So many of our insect species have mandible-type mouth parts, and then a few of them have more like a tube or a piercing kind of a mouth part. But mouth parts are important. We also life cycle is really important. Does anybody know what we sometimes call this kind of life cycle where there's no cocoon stage? Incomplete metamorphosis. Do you know why it's called incomplete metamorphosis? Do they know why?
I guess. They don't change into a totally different looking thing.
Yes. So, and I've heard it described both ways. I've heard it said it's incomplete because it doesn't have all the stages, because one of the stages would be a cocoon stage. But in my understanding, we call it incomplete because they do not completely change their body. When you're talking about a butterfly caterpillar and a butterfly, adult butterfly, those have almost nothing to do with each other in terms of what's there. They are totally reforming their body in that cocoon stage. It's almost like it's getting liquefied. If anyone has ever broken open a cocoon before accidentally, a butterfly cocoon, you will not find a caterpillar inside, and you don't find a butterfly inside. Do you know what you find inside? Goo. It's literally, if you're sort of in the middle right before they're going to turn into a butterfly, it's milky goo. Their body is getting melted down and reformed. So with your incomplete metamorphosis, that doesn't happen. You start as an egg, little grasshopper hops out, goes into a slightly bigger grasshopper, then it might do a couple of stages like that until it gets to the final stage. And really the only difference between the final stage and the little stages, does anybody know? There's actually reproduction is the most important one, and then usually the adults will have wings. The nymphs will never have wings unless they're just little wing buds that are getting started. But the babies don't fly. They don't have functional wings. Most adult insects have wings. So, what now?
Do they molt?
They do. They molt between every stage. When they go from a smaller nymph to a next bigger size nymph, they shed their skin each time. And they have to do that because their skin isn't very flexible. So they molt into a new skin. Once they get to the adult stage, they never molt ever again. The adults can't really change size much once they become an adult. And that's true for all adult insects. So molting is a big deal for them. You have to think about this. When an insect molts, like our body has bones on the inside. When we shed some of our skin, it's not a big deal. Insects don't have an internal skeleton. When they shed their skin, they're basically shedding everything. They keep some internal organs and some fluid, but everything else goes. The tops of their eyes get shed. Their mandibles, like the coatings of their mandibles get shed. Parts of their breathing system get shed. It's almost like they're getting a whole new body when they shed their skin. So this is incomplete metamorphosis, and this is complete metamorphosis. So you all know that a butterfly does this. They start as an egg. They hatch out into some kind of worm-like looking creature that we usually either call, if it's a butterfly or a moth, we call it a caterpillar. Do you know what the more general word for this is?
Larvae.
Larva. So when you have complete metamorphosis, your babies are called larvae. When you have incomplete metamorphosis, your babies are called nymphs. That's not super important. I don't know why those words were chosen, but that's usually the language that we use. Larvae tend to be very similar to worms. They still usually have legs. They don't always. Can anybody think of an example of an insect larva with no legs? Maggots. Maggots, a good example. But a lot of them do. But they're very worm-like. What scientists believe has happened here is that they've essentially backed up their evolution. Their babies have stepped backwards into more of a worm-like phase. Anybody who's in the medical profession, you probably know that like fetuses kind of start out as being kind of fish-like, right? It's almost like they're being born early. They're being born before they're ready, and then they make a second egg. You can almost think of it like that. So but the reason that complete metamorphosis is so important is because it gives the insects two chances and two ways to exploit the environment. When it's a baby, it can eat something like a leaf, and then when it's an adult, it can go take advantage of some other kind of food source. This might be important seasonally because let's say it's early in the season, the caterpillar has lots of leaves to eat. Later in the season, those leaves might all be dead, but there might be some nectar for the adult to eat. So it allows them to exploit sort of more opportunities. And far and away, the most species of insects are the ones that have complete metamorphosis. We call it complete once again because they completely change their whole life, their whole body. Butterflies do this, but also all beetles, all flies. So baby fly is a maggot, right? Has anybody ever seen a baby bee?
No.
Yeah, but honey bee keepers,
They look like maggots.
they look like maggots. A baby bee isn't a small bee. Once a bee becomes a bee, it never changes size. There's no baby bees, they're larvae. And that's true for all bees, ants, and wasps, all butterflies, moths, all beetles. Dragonflies are actually considered incomplete, even though they change a little bit more than some of the other ones do. But they don't make a cocoon. They don't fully melt themselves down and reform like these other things do.
All the ones make a cocoon?
What now?
All those animals have a...
They have a cocoon stage. We don't always call it a chrysalis, but beetles, flies, ants, bees, wasps, and butterflies and moths, all those have we call it a pupa is the technical name for that phase. But yeah, they're all basically cocoons. They all start out as something that's very worm-like, make a cocoon or a pupa, and then the adult comes out. So they completely change their body shape. So you have to think about that. All the beetles that you ever see outside, whatever kind of beetle it is, they started out as some kind of a larva. Every single one of them. Ladybugs. Anybody ever seen a ladybug larva? They're actually pretty common.
Yeah.
They look like a sort of a little black caterpillar. Really, really common. You've probably seen them many times. You might not have known it was a ladybug larva. Trying to move on here. These insect biology, we can't get into too much detail, but a lot of insect biology is sort of determined and governed by the fact that they are small. So it's small wonders, small biology. So, and this picture actually shows several examples of being small at once. But let me see if you guys can think of some examples. How can eating and finding food and water be different for something that's small, very small, instead of something that's big? Just think of some examples. Quantity would be one. Yeah, bugs a lot of times can get by on very small amounts of food. Some bugs can get by with almost no food for a long period. Like we said, the adults sometimes don't eat at all. So they sometimes don't need very much food because they're very small. Anything else? And same thing with water. They a lot of times, many of our insects get all the water that they need from the food that they eat. So a juicy leaf, a lot of times, will have all the water that they need. Another thing that's tough about being small is you can't see very well. Insects' eyes can't focus. Like mine can't either because I'm I'm blind, but I can sort of focus at different depths, right? Insects can't do that. They can just see in sort of one spot, and if it's here or here, they can't see it at all, or it's just blurry. So if your eyes don't work because they're too small, how can you find food? What are some ways? If somebody's raising their hand, of course I can't see. They use their other senses. They use chemical cues. A lot of insects will cue in on damaged plants. If a plant gets damaged by another bug or a lightning strike or something like that, they can smell that and they'll go right to it. So yeah, the chemical cues. One way that insects get around this is mom lays her eggs on the food. So if a mom monarch butterfly lays her eggs on the milkweed, then the baby doesn't have to find the food. It's already there. So those are some ways that being small impacts your feeding. What about obtaining oxygen? Does anybody know what this picture has to do with that? Do insects breathe through their nose or mouth?
Over through their skin.
Kind of. Yeah, they don't have a nose at all, and they don't breathe through their mouths. They don't do that. They have, did somebody say stomata?
Well, I think that's a plant.
But it's similar. You're right. It's called a spiracle. They have holes on the side of their body. I think we talked about this down at the stream a little bit too. But insects do not breathe through their mouths. They don't use their blood. They don't really have blood, but they don't use their fluids to move oxygen. They still have to have oxygen, and they get it directly through a series of pipes in their body. It's like air conditioning. It literally takes air directly to their cells. Complex series of tubes, which is, what was that, Al Gore talking about the internet, a complex series of tubes or something like that.
Did you call that a spherical?
Spherical is the name for the little holes on the side of insects that allow them to breathe.
That's all how they all breathe.
Yes, and the only exceptions would be if you have gills, and the gills are essentially sprout out of spiracles, sort of. So they sort of gather air and bring those in. So obtaining oxygen, and the reason that they don't use blood is because it just doesn't work really very well for them. Imagine trying to shoot liquid through a tiny vessel. You guys know just from how a fine sieve, how water gums up in it, you know? Water doesn't flow through it very well. If you have a small, it's capillary action and adhesion and cohesion, if you guys know what that is. When you have a very small thing, water doesn't go through it very efficiently. It's tight. But air goes through better. Air is less viscous. It goes through easier than fluids do. So that being small means that they have to get oxygen in a different way.
So is that a microscopic picture? Like what is...
That's a good question. This is just a caterpillar, and it's not microscopic. Their spiracles a lot of times are fully visible, that you can see. This is the side of a tobacco hornworm caterpillar. Finding mates, how is that difficult when you're small? It's basically the same thing we said for food.
Hard to get around.
It's hard maybe to get around from one place to the next. You can't see very well, so a lot of times you use chemical cues to find each other. One thing that moths have to do, moths can't see very well. Moths will use chemical cues, but moths also fly at the same height. This is sort of an instinct for them. But if you're the same species of moth, you try to fly at the same height at night so that you can more likely to run into each other. So one species flies up here, one species might fly down here. What about avoiding predators? How might being small influence your ability to either maybe make it better or worse for avoiding predators?
Harder to find.
You're harder to find because you're small, but you're also defenseless. You're also not very tough. You can't fight back. So being small means you can be very good at camouflage. And this creature is an example. You know, they have some pretty good camouflage when they're on a green tobacco leaf. So they're really good at being camouflaged. Also, because you're lightweight and small, you can live on your food, and you can be the same color as your food. So a cow can't do that. Cow can't blend in with, even if it was green, it would still look like a cow out there. It's too big. And a cow can't cling to the side of a grass blade and hide there. These guys can live on their food and be pretty well hidden in there because they're very lightweight and very small. So that helps them to avoid predators. Another thing they can do If you're a caterpillar on a leaf and a predator comes over, you can just fall to the ground. If you're a big animal and if you're a sloth and tried to do that, you'd be a crunched up sloth probably. But caterpillar can drop and just climb back up later. So dropping is a good strategy for a small creature. And then you can defend yourself with chemicals, which is a pretty good strategy. So stinging insects. When you're a bee or a wasp, when you sting, there's venom in there. And then a lot of caterpillars have stinging hairs, or at least sharp hairs that deter predators. So those are just some of the. And so when you're outside looking at a bug, try to think about, what is being small? How does being small impact the way this creature lives? And you could probably think of something just watching it move around. Now we're going to move to specific creatures in Kentucky. So here's some negative impacts to Kentucky's ecosystems by insects. For the most part, insects in natural areas, we like them. We like almost all of them. There's a lot of them. There's 15,000 species. There's only a handful, especially in natural areas. In agricultural areas, there's more. There's a few hundred species that we don't like. In forests in Kentucky, there's really only a few that are really bad. And it would be a good idea as a naturalist to know some of these. You might know some of these already. Does anybody know any of these creatures?
Ash borer.
We got emerald ash borer up in this corner. You can find evidence of emerald ash borer in lots of natural areas in Kentucky because they kill ash trees. You'll either have just no ash trees in the area, or you'll have a bunch of dead ash trees, or you will have healthy ash trees that it might be, as a naturalist, you might be able to help protect them by identifying them, and they can be sprayed at the base, or not sprayed, but soil injection and bark injection to help protect. Like if you have an individual, like really big ash tree you want to save, you can do that. So, what was that? Yes. This one's woolly adelgid, hemlock woolly adelgid. It overwhelms hemlock trees down the southeast part of the state. It doesn't kill them right away, but it eventually just it sucks out all their sap. It eventually kills them. This is another one that you can save individual trees with heavy duty doses of spray, or not spray, but injections in soil. So. Hemlock woolly adelgid.
So is that like woolly aphids?
Those are kind of like aphids. You're exactly right. They're very similar to aphids. They make a crud, waxy stuff on their body that helps protect them from predators. This one is really important because hemlock tree is a very important tree. It doesn't make up a large number of the trees in the forest, but next to streams in the forest, if you've ever seen a hemlock tree, there's huge trees, and they provide a ton of shade for the stream. And we talked about why shade is important for streams earlier, right? For that high oxygen content. When hemlock trees die, they tend to be taken over, at least especially in the short run, by nothing, just weeds and stuff. And so you get a denuded hot stream. And then later you might get, I don't know what would grow in their place, maybe silver maples, sycamores, stuff like that. Might not provide quite as good a shade as those hemlocks do in the deep forest. So losing hemlocks is really bad. All these things, by the way, this one, emerald ash borer, are both from other countries, brought here accidentally. Same thing is true with this one. Does anybody know what this one is? Asian longhorn beetle. This one is not here yet, but especially if any of you all might work in northern Kentucky. What time is it anyway? Oh my gosh, it's already time for you guys to go. Does anybody want to stay or can stay for just a few more minutes? Asian longhorn beetle. This is a particularly important one for people to know about because this one is not here yet, and we can do something about it. We can't really do much about emerald ash borer. It's pretty much all over the state already. Hemlock, we're trying to do things to stop it, but it's very widespread.
Hey, Blake?
Yes.
You have to be out here at 12:30.
Okay, that's good. That should be done by then. Asian longhorn beetle's not here yet. We can stop it. If people learn about this, and if people find it and tell extension agents or other agencies about this, we can find it and we can go in and stop it. It's fairly slow moving, but if it goes unchecked, it can really wipe out a lot of maple trees. So we really don't like that one. And then this one is actually a native species. This is southern pine beetle. It's a good one to know about. It's not an invasive pest, and it's not unnatural. It comes to Kentucky every few years, and it's supposed to be there. But it's a good one to interpret because a lot of times in a natural area you'll see a whole bunch of dead pine trees, and it's good to know why those pine trees are dead. And it's because southern pine beetle killed them I guess it's been about 18 years now. And they might be back again in another, who knows, 10 or 15 years. So southern pine beetle is a good one to know about. Otherwise, In Kentucky, we don't have a lot of bad beetles or bad insects in natural areas. There are definitely a few others that are worth learning about. Gypsy moth is a good one to learn about, especially if you happen to work up in the northeastern part of the state. It's also kind of good to be aware of where they come from. Emerald ash borer and Asian longhorn beetle have come to us from like many bad things from Ohio, right down through there. And then hemlock woolly adelgid has come up this way from sort of Virginia area there. And then southern pine beetle always comes north. So these things, it's kind of good to know what direction they come from and what areas are vulnerable.
There's a little triangular box on a tree on property. Do you know what they're looking for? Because it doesn't say.
It could be gypsy moth. They actually trap for quite a few things that aren't here yet. They track for Cyrex wasps, and but it might be a gypsy moth trap if it looks like sort of a white.
It's triangular. It's about this long.
Yeah.
It's red.
It's red. I'm not sure, but it's probably some kind of insect trapping program. Might be gypsy moth. Gypsy moth is one that we're just on the verge. We don't have it really yet, but it's very close to us, so we're always on the lookout for it. So in the same way the insects can impact us, we can impact them. So humans can have a negative impact on insects. Especially, sometimes we don't worry as much if we impact an insect's population, but when we start wiping out species, that's really bad. You can't come back from that.